Greetings from Turks and Caicos. I'm here in the Caribbean for a few days, just on vacation, took some time off. And I'll make a video about my time here before I leave because you guys know I like to make travel videos on this channel. But first things first, I wanted to tell you guys about the new Anna Nicole Smith documentary on Netflix. You might have heard of it, you might have already seen it. It came out yesterday at the time of this video. And I just find Anna Nicole Smith, her life story, as profiled, as detailed in this documentary, just fascinating. I think Anna Nicole Smith is one of those people that you're either gonna be like, I don't get it, yet another person that's celebrated for reasons I don't understand and whatever, or you're gonna be like me and just be riveted by all the nuances of this story, what it represents, the symbolism, I think, of American society and all that stuff. So first off, I should say, I think the reason why Anna Nicole Smith was such a tabloid fixation, why people are still talking about her, still making documentaries about her, why the public, the American public, was so fascinated by her, I think it boils down to what she represented, which was the classic, it's a story that's been told so many times, a true story that's been told so many times in American history, which is the rags to riches story of reaching the American dream, coming from nothing, and yet another story of a woman who grew up in a broken home, screwed up, life story, should have been a statistic in terms of how her life was going. Then seemingly overnight, she becomes famous, wealthy, this vixen. She turns into a sex symbol. And there really are a lot of parallels with Marilyn Monroe's story, but really there's a lot of, I think, figures like that in American society who kind of come out of nowhere and become these larger than life figures, and there's still an objectification to it. So in a sense, they go through abuse again. Like oftentimes these are women who grew up with abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. So it's like a different level of that when they reach this level of mega fame and wealth. But yet there's this likability to them as well. And I think with Anna Nicole Smith, she was the girl who grew up in the small town in Texas. So there's this thing that pulls at people's heartstrings in America that feels familiar, yet they recognize that her life, what it became, is 1 in a billion, right? Like that's not, the way her life evolved is not something that is going to happen realistically to the average girl who grows up in Texas, no matter what her means are, by the way. So it's kind of like this mind fuck of, kind of thing. If you're not that familiar with Anna Nicole Smith, I'll give you the gist of her life, the Cliff Notes version of her life story, which is profiled in this documentary on Netflix. The documentary basically is a biography of her life from start to finish. So Anna Nicole Smith grew up in this small town in Texas, outside of Houston, which is funny because I think in literally my last video, I mentioned how I hate Houston, Texas as a city. I think it's one of the most disappointing cities in America. So I'm like, if you grew up in a small town outside of Houston, I can only imagine what that small town is like if Houston, to me, is such as a city, such a disappointment. But anyway, she grew up in this small town, not a lot of resources in this town. High school dropout, ran away from home, starts working at the local fried chicken diner, marries the cook at the fried chicken diner, has a kid. Eventually she becomes a stripper. As a stripper, she meets a billionaire who just happens to waltz into the strip joint. The guy ends up essentially being her sugar daddy. So obviously she stops stripping eventually. She gets discovered by a photographer who sees a photo shoot she did with a local photographer in Texas. The photos get sent to Playboy. She becomes a Playboy model. From being a Playboy model, she becomes a big Playboy star, right? Like then Playboy keeps shipping her out and she does more Playboy stuff. And then before you know it, she's a model for Guess jeans, replacing Claudia Schiffer. If you're not familiar, Claudia Schiffer was a huge 90s top model. She was a Chanel girl, like a Chanel top model. So this girl from this small town in Texas who was a stripper 5 minutes ago suddenly is like booking these huge campaigns, showing up on billboards in Los Angeles, then gets asked to do some kind of like campy movie roles where she's the vixen in the movie. And before you know it, she's like a star and becomes a tabloid sensation. Eventually the public discovers this whole thing with the billionaire. And then that becomes a whole new thing, right? Because then he ends up dying and she goes to court, and it makes its way to the Supreme Court. This decision of, well, is she entitled to half of the estate, or should it just go down to his sons who are supposed to inherit his wealth? Eventually, she ends up dying prematurely at the age of, I believe she was 39 years old, from just all the medications she was mixing. Again, classic Hollywood story of somebody who is surrounded by enablers. She was taking all these meds, all these drugs, and her body couldn't handle it, and she died. The crazy thing, again, just like classic Hollywood folklore and these crazy life stories, the drama continued even after her death, because she'd had 2 children. One of them also died of the same way before she died. And I'm sure that sort of sped up her demise, that her son had died, especially because of reasons that could have been easily prevented. But then she had a second child, and then there was a whole paternity tabloid fiasco of like, who's the father? There were all these men who came out of the woodwork saying, I'm the father, I'm entitled to this child. And then the court case regarding the estate continued, was still going on, because it kept going to like a higher level in terms of the court system, and it made its way to the Supreme Court. So even though she had died, even though the billionaire had died, and I was reading about this last night after I watched the movie, the son who was supposed to inherit the estate had also died a few years back. He had already died, yet this case was continuing to figure out like where should the estate go? Like who is inheriting this? And there was at some point even talks about like, should her daughter, Anna Nicole Smith, should she inherit this? And in the end, they found that she was not entitled to this estate. These stories feel absurd, right? Like you hear this and you're like, if this was a TV show, I would never watch, because it's not realistic. It doesn't sound realistic. But the crazy thing is, this was her real life. Like this is an actual, talk about a true Hollywood story. This is a true Hollywood story. It's just so gnarly, and it's also so bizarre. And this is why to me it's such like an American phenomenon and an American story, because there's elements of like campiness and absurdity. You know, she was like kind of a country bumpkin. She literally worked at the fried chicken spot after being a high school dropout. And then she becomes a Playboy model, and then she finds this oil tycoon at the strip club. Like, it just feels so American. Like, this stuff does not happen in other countries. And I guess it's because America is this weird place of extremes where you can actually have billionaires. Billionaires exist in capitalist societies. What also exists in capitalist societies is these girls from really broken homes in small towns in the middle of nowhere who are just looking to feed themselves, feed their kid, and make it and survive. And so you have these weird extremes that every once in a blue moon collide. And that was Anna Nicole Smith. That was her life. I think the level of that fame, or even notoriety, I would call it, that she had with the tabloids and the American public's fascination with her. And they talk about this in the documentary, that there's celebrity photographers like paparazzis in the movie who talk about how they would get paid way more for an Anna Nicole Smith shot because she was so theatrical and so dramatic that it was like always a money shot with her. I'm not talking about fashion. I'm talking about like a tabloid photo. Even that they knew would mean more dollar signs for them than the average celebrity, because of who she was as a character, like as a ham, but also the kind of stories that she generated and the kind of buzz that she generated with the American public in terms of eyeballs on these tabloid magazines. But it makes sense to me because I think, again, she repeated this legacy, the Marilyn Monroe sort of blueprint of a very unique type of fame and celebrity, which is being both aspirational and inspirational. What I mean by that is, historically, if you look at really, really famous icons, usually their kind of fame was aspirational in the past. I would say up until the last decade or so, fame in America was always aspirational. So like, if we're talking about supermodels, right, like a Cindy Crawford or Christy Turlington, their kind of beauty was a regal beauty of like, oh, I wish I could look like that, but the average person can never look like that. Or I don't know, like when we're talking about icons like Diana Ross, right? The way she sang, the way she carried herself on stage, it was like a regalness, sophistication, and an allure that today just doesn't really exist, I think, in today's celebrity world. Today, with the social media stars, and I feel like there's a lot more like gimmicky artists, like in the music business. Now it's more about inspirational. So if you look at social media influencers, I feel like star power isn't what it used to be. Now it's more like, are you relatable? Are you likable? If you look at ad campaigns, it's more about body inclusivity, body positivity. You have different kinds of personas to attract different kinds of audiences. And it's more about connecting people to you versus, of course, with aspirational appeal, there's always going to be a certain level of distance between you and that celebrity. And I think Anna Nicole Smith is part of a very rare group of celebrities where she was both aspirational and inspirational, meaning somebody in a similar small town in Texas could be like, oh my God, she's from a small town like me, she talks like me. But yet she also, in her prime, was gorgeous. Like the Guess campaigns are gorgeous photographs of this voluptuous vixen. That blonde bombshell sort of Americana aesthetic. So she managed to be both someone people aspired to be like, but also who they felt safe with. Usually with these kinds of movies, I'm disappointed because when they profile somebody who's been talked about so much, they don't usually add much to the story. It's like a repetition of the stuff you already knew. But I actually really liked this documentary. I felt that they did a good job chronicling her rise to fame and eventually her demise. They also did a good job of having a lot of people in her life at different stages of her life be involved in this movie. And I also like that it was accountable. Like it was honest in saying certain things still don't make sense. For me, the biggest takeaway, other than again, the fascinating element of her kind of repeating this American folklore fantasy of the rags to riches story, the woman who comes from nothing and becomes something and becomes a symbol of more. Beyond that, I felt like the biggest takeaway for me with this documentary was the conversation around credibility. So, you know, obviously she dies because of this overdose. So addiction is a central character in this whole story. And I feel like oftentimes that's something that people don't want to talk about with these celebrities. Like with Marilyn Monroe, I feel like people always idolize her to this day, but to me it's such a cautionary tale. And these are drug addicts. Like these are people who have serious issues. And even watching the movie, I was like, for her to have this kind of dependency, not just on drugs, but there's this theme too in the movie of she really wants attention and she wants to feel loved, even if it's a superficial love of paparazzi. I mean, it's not often you see a celebrity like loving paparazzi attention, and you could tell she loved it in these footage clips in the documentary. So I was actually watching the movie thinking like, I wonder if she had other issues like a personality disorder or something else, like a narcissism kind of thing. And so I was glad that with Anna Nicole Smith, the movie went into that. This idea of credibility. Was she credible? Like, was everything that she said the truth? Because there's a lot of things that are left kind of unanswered. There were discrepancies over her childhood. She would claim that her mother was awful to her, abused her, all these things. She didn't have a relationship anymore with her mom by the time she died. But in the movie, they point out how several people from her childhood are like, that's not really what happened. Like, she grew up in a stable home. Her mom was a cop. It doesn't really get more like regimented and disciplined than that. It's kind of murky, right? Because if she was a high school dropout and she ran away from home at like 16, there's definitely some stuff that was going on there that was not normal. Like, you don't just happen to do that because you're a wild child. Like, there has to be some stuff that's chaotic at home, I think, for that to happen. What I think is also really interesting is, and I don't know if the movie did this intentionally or I was just reading into it, but I was also questioning the credibility of the people in the movie, in the documentary, those who were around her. You know, anytime you see people suddenly circle back and want to be on camera to tell their side, you always have to be a little suspicious. It's just some of them, the way they're dressed in the movie, I'm like, they're looking to extend their 15 minutes. Like, they were on her reality show, they were with her in tabloid shots, and now they want to be here to tell their side. So all around, there's this question of credibility and accountability. And when you look back at her story, all the people that must have enabled her to even allow her to get to this point of overdosing, it's not easy to do that. Like, with prescriptions, you need to have the doctors in on it. You need to have the assistants and the staff in on it. So all these people were allowing her to live this kind of life, presumably because they were on her payroll. So they don't want to upset the situation. There's also mention in the movie of how if you defied her, she'd kick you out of the inner circle. So when you have a situation like that, where you know that if you're not giving somebody what they want, you're going to be kicked out of the fame circle, the money circle, the lifestyle, the luxury, the fame, whatever, these people stick around. And what happens is you're surrounded by yes men, you're surrounded by enablers. So she did it to herself, but at the same time, you have to question like the morality of the people around her. It's all it's fascinating to me how people can get themselves to this point. The likelihood of her coming from this small town and becoming such a famous icon, I still can't get over the Guess jeans thing, that she replaced Claudia Schiffer, who was this huge top model in the 90s, a Chanel girl, Chanel top model. This girl, Anna Nicole Smith, comes from a small town in Texas. She worked at the fried chicken diner. She was a stripper. That she went from that to then getting with this billionaire, getting in Playboy, becoming a Guess girl, suddenly landing roles in movies. They talk about it in the movie, in the documentary, how she was up for the Mask role that was made famous by Cameron Diaz in the end. And I'm like, how did the path that she took, like the meteoric rise, is so unlikely and so unusual that you're like, wow. The chances, she hit the lottery, she won the lottery, but she also completely sabotaged it. And it makes you think about this stuff people talk about with manifestation and the law of attraction. It's like, there's an old friend in the movie who says she predicted all this. Like, she said, I'm gonna be just like Marilyn Monroe, I'm gonna be a huge model, famous model, blah, blah, blah. She did it. Like, she did exactly what she dreamed of doing, but then she also destroyed it. And all this stuff makes me think again about narcissism, this concept of narcissism, like, to build something so big in terms of fame and just the attention she got and the wealth, does there have to be an element of like, you already think you're there when you're not actually there and you're working at the local fried chicken place or at the local strip club? Because the fact that she fulfilled this, she created this, but then to also self-sabotage in such a destructive way, that's like textbook narcissism. She sort of broke the system. Like, she should have been a statistic and she broke that pattern. And yet in the end, she ended up repeating the pattern. She died, not only did she die of drugs, but her son died of drugs as well. And in the end, it's like there's nothing to show for it. I mean, she has a daughter, but that daughter inherited nothing and is being raised by this totally separate entity, this guy who the movie claims she didn't even really like that much. She just wanted to have a kid for the sake of having a kid. So there's all these elements that are just so odd to me, so peculiar in terms of the things that she would do for the sake of attention and feeling wanted, like down to having children. That feels like textbook narcissism, and yet people adored Anna Nicole Smith. Like, even in her personal life, she had all these people sort of circled around her. They, I guess, fell for this allure and maybe a genuineness they saw in her, but it makes me wonder, like, how genuine could she have really been if she had such chaotic behavior? Like, to hear somebody vocalize that they want to have a child because they're lonely, which is essentially, it sounds like, why she had both children, based on what the movie says. Like, that would freak me out if somebody I knew said, I just want to have a kid so that I can never be lonely again. Like, to me, that sounds like a mental illness to say that. So it just makes you think about the kind of people she was attracting into her life, and this life that she attracted in general. It's like, all for what, right? It goes down to what I talked about in another video recently, this idea of when you have superficial values, a superficial life and superficial results always end up coming back to you. And I guess to me, that's why at the end of the day, it's such an American story. It's such a classic Americana, like, folklore story, because despite the glamour, despite the fame, the beauty, all of that stuff, if you just poke at the surface, it was all kind of hollow. It was all like a mask. And she seemed like a very broken person actually beneath all of that. What do you guys think about this? What do you think of her? What do you think of this movie if you've seen it? Very curious to hear what you guys have to say.